This paper is about a contrapuntal ecocritical reading of Abysmal return in contemporary Middle Eastern and Native American fiction. The research offers a contrapuntal, ecocritical, and comparative reading of contemporary Middle Eastern and Native American fiction. Nature is emblematic of socio-political, psychological, archetypal, and historical issues in first David Grossman's novella Yani on the Mountain, Murid Barghoutis I Saw Ramallah, and Louis Erdrich's Love Medicine. The reading is also informed by Edward Said's contrapuntal approach, highlighting absences and omissions, as well as the portrayal of the other. Nature, anthropomorphized and personified, is turned from an element of harmony to that of discord, thanks to man's chaos. Several images, symbols, and motifs are recurrent in each work, in addition to the multiplicities of narratives and tenses. The cyclical narrative structure and zigzag progression of storytelling and episodic narrative in Erdrich's case accentuate the somehow morbid mood and sordid atmosphere. Furthermore, the author's human dissatisfaction with chaos is crystallized in their statement on past and current affairs, as well as the somehow gloomy future prospects. All this is best embodied in the womb-to motif, prevalent in the three works, where the journey home is, in fact, an engulfment by abysmal return. Mythical as well as biblical and Quranic allusions paradoxically strip the setting of the expected positive connotations, only to reinforce the apocalyptic quality of these counter-narratives. Sociopolitical and historical subtexts glimmer beneath, reinforcing man's setting loose of evil in Pandora's box. From Yiddish and Canaanite to Chippewa and Ojibwa, the three works spark a journey of aesthetic beauty and involve the reader in an urgent commitment to pressing human needs. All this is beautifully done through abysmal return to Mother Nature. If we start with Grossman, in David Grossman's Yani on the Mountain, written in and published in 1980, nature is usually personified with negative connotations all along. The biblical ascent of Moses on the mountain and the revelation of the Ten Commandments on the Sinai mountain are always foregrounded, but with an opposite, apocalyptic undertones, very much like the difficulty of attaining salvation at the hands of Jesus Christ, because of the undeserving human beings in Yeats' The Second Coming or Beckett's Waiting for Godot. The metaphor, quote, "the rock is only a massive lump," unquote, is reminiscent of a malignant tumor. The bushes are stubborn. Even ascent is far from that of Moses or Jesus Christ. I climb a step in the rock, cling to protuberances with my hands, maneuver acrobatically between the familiar cracks. The ascent has to be accomplished in a certain way. The ironic, secular, acrobatic maneuvers, together with the hazardous protrudings, fissures, and cracks, undermine the current war and post-war state, only to culminate in the eventual bombing of the mountain to erase all traces of military presence. Yani's death wish is eventually expressed in relationship to the mountain. Quote, "I want to vanish with the mountain, to lean against the green sacks and cease to be," unquote. Yani's identification with the mountain is interpreted by Nimra, the humanitarian activist, and Elisha, the idealist and poet, as part of Yani's, quote, "childish dreams," unquote. In other words, military service and war are as synonyms for nationalism and patriotism are nothing but childish dreams. Quote, "You've lost 9 years of your life, wasted them here. Can't you see? This is the moment to do the right thing, Yani. Come down from the mountain," unquote. The request, the pressing request, "Yani, come down from the mountain," recurs like a refrain, ironically called Catoesque conclusion by Yani and reiterated by Nimra, the peace seeker and humanitarian. Significantly enough, in France, the sewage, what was called the Watergate of lines, the important journalistic scoop, is related to Nimra, especially to Nimra, who is at one with nature. This accentuates man's transgression against nature, symbolized by the sewage and vomit in the stream, in the labyrinth of the underground city, between the canals of the churning filth. Nimra, disgusted at the human pollution of nature, vomits, and her vomit was borne away on the dark stream, further worsening the pollution. Unfortunately, Nimra's disgust soon leads to her depression. Knowing the glaring difference between her and the transgressors against nature, Yani knows she will never return to him or even to Elisha. Quote, she had gone to die by herself in a corner of her forests. Unquote. Nimra's inherent repugnance at the disgust intrinsic in humanity is foreshadowed right from the very first page of the novella. Spitting and urinating contests amongst the soldiers are described in full detail, provoking the reader's revulsion. To make matters worse, the soldiers go and eat immediately afterwards, indicating a numbing of the natural human senses. Spit, urinate, secrete saliva, and piss are few amongst many of the terrible revolting contests of the soldiers, and consequently of warring humanity, shocking readers at the outset of the novella. The incessant allegorical identification of Yani and the mountain explains how the whole novella has been incessantly preparing the reader for the terrible climax, the transgression against nature, bombing the mountain to hide traces of the military and intelligence base. Yani and his mountain were both abandoned by Nimra in a clear statement on the futility of war. Nimra detested both cynicism and military obtuseness, meaning she disagreed with Elisha, the cynic, and Yani, the soldier. They left the mountain. They left me all by myself, says Yani. They mocked my dreams. I wanted them both to volunteer for the regular army, like me, and go serving on the mountain. They shattered the foundations I built for myself. Unquote. The final touching apostrophe where the officer is addressing the mountain is a poignant apocalyptic tone. It reveals how human beings, by going into wars with each other, are no longer at one with nature, by disrupting its harmonious rhythms. The personification portrays the mountain as a close friend, betrayed by Yani. Quote, now all that remains is the slow counting of hours, only remorse towards the mountain beneath our feet, which trusts us so blindly, oblivious to our treachery, the treachery of the grasshoppers who have been stepping on its surface all these years. The apologetic tone is accentuated by the subsequent medical metaphor. Yani sees himself and his colleagues as causing a malignant tumor in the body of the mountain, a heavy lump condensing inside it, tearing its guts apart, spraying it in all directions. Anagnorisis, coming at the hands of Nimra and Elisha, is also linked to angry nature, mainly because of man's warring attitude and unnatural behavior. People our age, all over the world, were living full, complete lives during those wonderful years, while we were here in the sandstorms and the thunderstorms, always half-starved, afraid of unseen enemies, eating our lives away. Unquote. The apocalyptic overtones are expressed in the opening of the abyss, both literally and metaphorically, out of which, quote, giant lizards are escaping in all directions in haste and great confusion, their tails dragging behind them and drawing lines in the sand, and their faces, their grinning monster faces, are grim. Unquote. The dystopia is best expressed in the perfect image of doomsday, where all creatures are frantically wandering in horror. Geckos and spiders, beetles and giraffes, a countless multitude of tiny creatures are swarming everywhere today. The sand beneath my feet is full of activity. The birds of prey, the buzzards and the hawks, circle the sky expectantly, gather in the wings and claws, swoop again and again, bringing a swift death to these little denizens of the dark, which some mysterious force has banished from their usual homes and sent scurrying into the sunlight." Unquote. The earth therefore is not still, and the abyss is widening, and utter devastation is imminent. The abysmal return to Yani's homeland was foreshadowed very early in the novella. Quote, "I turn away from the edge of the cliff, towards the position set well back from the abyss. These days I'm not sufficiently sure of myself. I feel comfortable sitting on the damp ground between the disintegrating sandbags." Unquote. The gathering darkness of the abyss, amid the vegetation sprouting widely over the camp's sewage pipe, foreshadows the above-mentioned sewage Watergate scoop in France. After its bombing, the mountain top will ultimately tread on corpses, including mine, meaning Yanis. That's another unnatural personification of nature, highlighting the tomb pole. In the meantime, the alienation and estrangement of the soldiers are accentuating. This is spelled out at the end in one of the rare explicit statements on war and peace. This has been the last in a whole line of antagonized nature personifications and metaphors due to man's unnatural behavior. The very first word of the novella is the wind, that soon turns out to be a malevolent wind. Similarly, the natural connotations of the sun endowing people with warmth and light are subverted. We have the pale light of the sick sun instead. Our primal fear is as frightening as the thickest bush. The rapid dancing jet cleaves the air like a hissing snake, and even the thin, tall friend is as ominous as a raven. Furthermore, the thorny branches are beating down tangled growth of the tree trunks. Significantly enough, Nimra, the humanitarian activist and philanthropist, ends up somehow clinically depressed. Elisha, the poet, is drowned in cynicism, while Yani, the patriot and nationalist, with a death wish to die with the bombardment of the mountain. And Mark Nestor, the lecturer in Russian literature, who taught people love, is tortured and failing miserably to spread any message of love. It's like a revisionist counter-narrative to what is considered patriotism and belonging, since all four paths of peace, literature, war, and love have been ruthlessly thwarted in almost all continents of the world mentioned in the novella. If we move from Grossman to Murid al-Barghouti's I Saw Ramallah, we will find that, as in Grossman, nature is antagonistic to human beings in Barghouti's I Saw Ramallah, the biblical and Quranic parable of Ezekiel and the wasteland, or Jerusalem, recurs poignantly throughout the novel. Unfortunately, however, resurrection seems unattainable this time. At the outset of the novel, water is acting with the enemy to strip the Palestinians of their life. Streams and rivers are almost dry, while death by water reminds us of both T.S. Eliot and Louis Erdrich. Quote, water without water, as though the water apologized for its presence on this boundary between two histories, two faiths, two tragedies. The Jordan River is narrow, without proper water or sound. Returning to Ramallah, Barghouti was incredibly shocked to see how the river was narrow and dry. It had become a river without water, almost without water. Nature has colluded with Israel in stealing its water. It used to have a voice. Now it was a silent river, a river like a parked car. Unquote. Both the Palestinians and the river have poignantly lost their voice. They no longer have an identity or a say in matters. Their life is being lived for them, while critical decisions are being made on their behalf. Prelapsarian Eden and Eden after the fall form the very first antithetical image that strikes Barghouti once he steps into his family's courtyard 30 years later. I used to tell my Egyptian friends at the university that Palestine was green and covered with trees and shrubs and wildflowers. What are these flowers? What are these hills, bare and chalky? Had I been lying to people then? Did I paint for strangers an ideal picture of Palestine because I'd lost it? I said to myself, When Tamim comes here, he will think I've been describing another country." Unquote. This is exactly the biblical and Quranic allusion to Ezekiel's wasteland, Jerusalem of the past, only this time with no hope of resurrection whatsoever. Eden here is the image Barghouti retained of Palestine, with its olives, figs, and palm trees, only traces of the past now. Barghouti wonders how he is going to explain the discrepancy to his son Tamim. Quote, "Had I been describing Deir Ghassana with its surrounding olive groves and convincing myself I was describing the whole country?" Ironically enough, even his own place that used to abound in olives and figs is now almost barren. Quote, "Instead of the tree, I saw a large cement block. The fig had been cut off at the point where its awesome trunk met the earth." Unquote. Artificiality has encroached upon the signs of life. Nature is now choked by cement. Similarly, asphalt crouches upon the beauty of the hills to add another element of artificiality, further choking nature. Significantly, they are both overlooking the settlements. Similarly, steel flowers ironically act like lilac fingerprints. To accentuate the bitter loss of paradise, figs and olives should be contextualized as another Quranic allusion. It's both literal and metaphorical. Intertextuality stresses the loss as linked to abysmal return. Does the stranger return to where he was? Is he himself returning to a place, our house? After exile, Barghouti felt as if he sinned to buy olive oil. Quote, "From the day we knew anything, we knew that olives and oil were there in our houses. Nobody from the village ever bought oil or olives. The village sells oil and olives to Ramallah, Amman, to the Gulf." Similarly, when Barghouti bought one fig for $1 in Vienna, he felt apologetic to the fig tree of his childhood and had become like a family member to him. He explains to his wife and son, both writers like him too, in a personification similar to Yani's apology to the mountain, "I said to Radwa and Tamim that I had committed a crime against the fig tree of Darrat." Unquote. Pebbles and rocks form another biblical allusion, also reminiscent of William Blake's poems about the two sides of Jesus Christ. Like Grossman and Erdrich, the negative connotations and inverted symbolic import are all we get in Barghouti. Similarly, the dust of the land is reminiscent of the biblical "from dust to dust." Other instances of nature as related to death are raindrops and flowers as related to graveyard, as well as cactus plant in the cemetery. The palm tree is the furthest from the ones in paradise. The spring is obstinate and the mountains are bare. Similarly, in Erdős's Love Medicine, June, the character most at one with nature, is shockingly the one killed by nature, namely snow and Chinook wind. Quote, "The snow fell deeper that Easter than it had in 40 years, but June walked over it like water and came home." Like Barghouti, it's related to water, an abysmal return. However frail nature is, latent power will be manifested soon in an attempt to stop man's transgression. Quote, "With every root I prized up, there was return, as if I was kin to its secret lesson. The touch got stronger as I worked through the grassy afternoon. Uncurling from me like a seed out of the blackness where I was lost, the touch spread, the spiked leaves full of bitter mother's milk, a buried root, a nuisance people dig up and throw in the sun to wither, a globe of frail seeds that's indestructible." Unquote. Spring is cruel, exactly like Barghouti, and like April is the cruelest month in T.S. Eliot. And Easter is the furthest from the hope for resurrection. Quote, "After that fall spring, when the storm blew in, covering the state, all the snow melted off, and it was summer. It was almost hot by the week after Easter when I found out, in Mama's letter, that June was gone. Not only dead, but suddenly buried, vanished off the land like the sudden snow. Unquote. The earth turns out to be the tomb and the final abode, not really the womb. Quote, I felt smallness, how the earth divided into bits and kept dividing. Unquote. Unfortunately, this fate applies to June too, who's part and parcel of nature. They weren't expecting her home on the reservation. Right at the outset of the technically unique novel, the word reservation strikes the ghetto connotations as related to the history of Native Americans, later to be casually tackled in the novel. Though a long time has elapsed, June's steps on her way back home were confident. Intuitively, she felt part and parcel of nature. However, the return home betrayed her, or betrayed her trust, with the injustice of humanity all set against her. Quote, she had walked far enough to see the dull orange glow, the canopy of low-lit clouds over Williston, when she decided to walk home instead of going back there. A Chinook wind, she told herself. She made a right turn off the road, walked up a drift frozen over a snow fence, and began to pick her way through the swirls of dead grass and icy crust of open ranch land. These tragic scenes have to be read in conjunction with an earlier scene, narrated towards the end of the novel, however, that further explains June's harmony with nature. Quote, June swam without effort, rolled, dived up and down like a fish, took Gordy farther and farther away from shore, towards the middle of the lake. Unquote. Elsewhere, when Gordy was looking for her, he found her underwater. Quote, then all of a sudden, she rose before Gordy, something like a mermaid or something, reeds dropping off her shoulders, the water streaming down her face, and the snaky ends of her hair. Unquote. It's the perfect image of someone incredibly and rhythmically harmonious with nature, only to be betrayed by the ugly side of nature. A kind of statement on the innocent lives lost in this world, because others wrongly misunderstand the frontier myth as uprooting nature and those at one with nature in the process of crossing all borders, and also overcoming all obstacles at the expense of humanity. Historicizing events and the political context are rarely directly provided by Erdrich, but dropped every now and then, like flashes that highlight or interpret certain incidents. The past frontier myth is reiterated in border crossings, only here with rivers or streams promising a faint glimmer of purgation. It's a dark, thick, twisting river. The bed is deep and narrow. I thought of June. The water played in wars beneath me, or flexed over sunken cars. Unquote. Like Barghouti, the bridge is a recurrent symbol, and the great ancient ocean has shrunk to a small river. Quote, I'd heard this river was the last of an ancient ocean, miles deep, that once had covered the Dakotas and solved all our problems. It was easy to still imagine us beneath them, vast unreasonable waves, but the truth is, we live on dry land. I got inside. The morning was clear. A good road led on, so there was nothing to do but cross the water and bring her home. Unquote. Like Barghouti again, homecoming and water crossing are related to the bridge and the borders. Quote, I came to the bridge over the Boundary River. I was getting pretty close to home now. Unquote. Earlier, this is related to the borders either of the reservation or of the historic frontier. Quote, we held each other's arms, tight and manly, when we got to the border. A windbreak swallowed him up. Unquote. A contrapuntal reading easily discerns, therefore, that the other, both Egyptian and Palestinian, in Yani on the Mountain, is mostly absent and silent from the perspective of Yani. The hostile desert is linked to the unseen enemy. When it comes to the humanitarian or loving Nimra, however, there is her relationship to Arab friends in London and giving shelter to Arabs. There is one mention of the Arab with explosives amidst Israelis, together with scattered references to Egyptian settings, starting with Sinai and Dahab to Cairo and Luxor, let alone the centralized implicit import of the human reversal of the connotations and echoes of the biblical revelation of the Ten Commandments on Mount Tur in Sinai. On the other hand, a contrapuntal reading of Barghouti's I Saw Ramallah shows that the other is never absent. In fact, it's a hegemon, it's sovereign, overwhelmingly present and omnipotent. Like Grossman and Erdrich, however, what Said calls the moral geography of the novel is revealed to be the furthest from what he calls secular. Setting is heavily loaded with ideological filiation and attachment. In Barghouti, however, the novel is an autobiography with real-life names of the author and his family members. Furthermore, the gravity of history is clear in the outspoken condemnation of Zionism, for example, in I Saw Ramallah, as totally distinct from Judaism, and the constant historicizing of events in I Saw Ramallah and in Erdős' Love Medicine. Historicizing is also present in casual references in Erdős, but without the clear condemnation by Native Americans of the other or of early settlers. Crossing borders or frontiers is also more obvious in Barghouti and Erdős. In Erdős' Love Medicine, June, the one at one with nature, has always been seen as typically Native American, and this has been always stressed. Sometime earlier, Chippewa gods, an American Indian water monster, Misipshu, as well as biblical god, are brought to bear on a historical incident of ethnic cleansing of Native Americans. Again, the problem does not lie in religions, but in man's abuse of religion. As usual in the novel, the springboard from which all events stem is June. Here, in the memory of Aunt June, left by a white man to wander off in the snow. How else to explain My Touch Don't Work, and further back, to the old-time Indians who were swept away in the outright germ warfare and dirty dog killing of the whites? In those times, us Indians were so much kindlier than now. Here, it's very much in Love Medicine, like Barghouti's I Saw Ramallah. This is one of the rare incidents of explicit condemnation of the injustices committed against Native Americans in the past and of the abuse of religions, and of course the injustices and transgression committed against nature as embodied by June. In Love Medicine, therefore, historicizing events and the political context are never directly provided, very much like I Saw Ramallah by Barghouti, but dropped every now and then, like flashes that highlight or interpret certain incidents. To conclude, both approaches, the contrapuntal approach, especially provided by Edward Said, and the ecocritical approach, highlight the idea of man's injustices committed against nature and the chaos man has brought to this world. Thank you.